They laughed. My granddaughter looked up from her slice of cake, batted at the icing with a sticky finger, and said, plain as day, "Grandma, you're nobody." The table went quiet for a heartbeat. Then my son laughed, as if he'd meant it to be a joke. Jessica smiled like she'd coached the line. Plates scraped, someone clinked a glass, and the restaurant resumed its chatter as if nothing had happened. I sat there in my navy dress, the pearls my husband had given me, and felt something inside me break and, oddly, begin to harden. My name is Margaret Sullivan, though most people call me Maggie. I'm 67, a retired high school English teacher, and a widow. Frank and I planted roses along the side yard of our little house for 40 years. Every summer, the garden is exactly the way he liked it. 2 rows of deep red at the path's edge, a pink climbing rose near the back steps. That afternoon, before the birthday, the smell of Sumatran coffee was still warm in my car cup holder. By the time Chloe spoke, that scent was all that was left of comfort. When you help someone for long enough, when you do it out of love, out of habit, because your spouse is gone and the house gets quieter, you start to blur the line between kindness and being taken for granted. You tell yourself you are supporting your family, that a mortgage payment here and a tuition bill there are just what good grandmothers do. You don't keep a ledger, not really. You keep a mat where the grandchildren can take off their shoes, you sew on buttons, you sit through school plays and fake queasy looks at the scary parts of the movies. You do the soft things, and gradually the hard things pile onto your plate, and you hold them there lest everything else collapse. I should have seen it coming. I remember thinking that after Frank died, that maybe my good nature would be my downfall. But grief softens you. Remembering doesn't sharpen your eyes so much as it makes you more willing to forgive. The payment started small. A furnace in the dead of January, a courtesy, I thought, since David's family had just moved into that house. The kids needed soccer cleats one season, Chloe's braces, Tyler's car repair. The money flowed in ways I told myself were temporary fixes. Then there were the mortgage payments. For 2 years, I set up a monthly transfer to cover their mortgage. $2,000 a month, which totaled $48,000 over 24 payments. Why did I do it? Because the thought of them losing the house felt unterrible. Because David, my son, sometimes had trouble holding steady. Because Jessica said things like, "We're just between jobs, Mom," and "We'll pay you back next month." Next month became next year too many times. Those numbers don't mean much to some people. They sound like a nice retirement cushion evaporating for others. For me, they were the price of ongoing peace. I believed my money was a bandage keeping fractures from widening. But that night, in that restaurant, the bandage was made into a punchline. After Chloe's nobody line, I said nothing. I smiled because that's what you do in social situations. You smile and act like it didn't hurt. I sipped my coffee and the bitter flavor steadied me. Only later, when I unfolded my napkin and found the grease from the pie, did the thought arrive, enough. Sometimes the most powerful word, I told myself later as I climbed the stairs to my quiet house, is simply no. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the roses visible through the back window and the bank website open on my laptop. The auto pay that had carried $2,000 out of my account each month was right there. The orange scheduled transfer button, the small print, the repeat every 30 days notation. 24 payments, 2 years. I scrolled through the withdrawals, signed images of checks I'd written at Christmas, wire transfers, a credit card payment after a family emergency text. It was all there in neat fonts and timestamps. Seeing it surfaced something that raw emotion couldn't. It was not just a series of favors, it was a pattern. So I did something that surprised even me. I canceled the next scheduled transfer. It was a quiet choice, no big speech, no dramatic letter. I sat very still for a long minute after I hit the confirm button. Then the phone blew up. First, a text, "Mom, did you forget?" from David. Then 3 more. "Everything okay? Need help?" from Jessica. Missed calls, voicemails, one of them saying, "You can't do this, Ma." Another one came from David that evening while I was in the garden clipping a brown leaf from the rose bush. His voice was pitched low, practiced gentleness over a tremor of agitation. "Mom, please, we're short this month. If you could just—" "Figure it out," I said into the air for my roses to hear. There are words that change how people see you. "Figure it out" was not unkind, but it was a boundary drawn like a line in the sand. They didn't like the line. The panic started as you'd expect, frantic texts, accusations, thinly veiled as concern. "You're being selfish," Jessica wrote in one message. In another, she accused me of being spiteful toward their kids. When the messages didn't shame me into resuming payments, the tone changed. There were guilt plays, photos of Chloe curled on the couch, a video of Tyler trying to fix a bike wheel, the caption, "Mom, they're hurting." The family chat erupted in a chorus of exasperation from relatives who had always accepted my help before and now were apparently shocked I wouldn't help out just this once. At the door that weekend, David stood with his hands in his coat pockets like a man rehearsing a speech. He looked tired in a way that made me want to hand him a cup of coffee the way I had for years. But annoyance sat over the tiredness like a second skin. "I just don't understand why you would do this now," he said. Exasperation replaced by a helplessness that should have been for my shoulders to hold, not for me to shoulder. "We were counting on you." I thought of the pearls resting against my chest. I thought of my husband, Frank, who had always managed money with a careful thumb. "People aren't counting on me," I said slowly. "They're counting on the bank of Maggie to keep running." The words felt strange in my mouth, funny too, because I had spent a lifetime making do for others. I didn't like the sound of my own refusal, but I liked the result. The first consequence of my decision was not legal, it was domestic. Friends noticed my absence at some gatherings. The grandchildren's visits changed. Sometimes they'd come with their eyes darting around like cats who sniffed trouble in the air. I found a little girl asking if she could have a sleepover, and then, when I agreed, later asking if I could pay for pizza. It was humiliating. I recall one afternoon when Chloe, on her way out the door, said under her breath, "Nobody wants you to do anything." It was not a question. It was a verdict. Within a month of that first canceled transfer, things escalated in a way I never anticipated. David filed papers. I will not pretend I was really shocked. If you'd asked me then whether he would try to take control of my finances, I might have said it was possible in some legalistic way. People do strange things when they're cornered. But I didn't foresee the audacity of his chosen weapon, a petition for conservatorship. It arrived as a crisp envelope handed to me by a deputy. The heading, "Petition for Conservatorship," was typed in a font that made it feel official and final. The petition was a collection of claims designed to paint me as incapable, intermittent forgetfulness, alleged confusion about managing bills, an insistence that I needed someone to step in to protect my interests. The paper stroked at stereotypes and anxieties, as if summoning the image of a frail widow fumbling with a bank ledger would justify seizing control. There were even annotations about the best interests of the estate and suggested immediate restrictions on my access to certain accounts. I felt a cold surge of indignation before the fear. My first teacherly instinct was to correct the record. I had always been meticulous about my medical appointments, filling out forms. I kept lists. I had written budgets when the mortgage payments began. When I opened a closet and pulled out a box of bank statements, check images, and a small spiral notebook where I jotted the dates and amounts of every aid I gave, I realized there was a case to be made if I could make it clear, simply and plainly, the way you'd explain grammar to a teenager who muddled subject and verb. I called Sarah Blackwood, the attorney a neighbor had recommended. Sarah had the no-nonsense manner of someone who'd grown up in a household where words were instruments, not decoration. She listened, took a breath, and said a few things that steadied me because they were practical instead of pitying. "We'll document everything," she said. "Medical records, bank statements, contemporaneous notes. If you have written evidence of your capacity, that helps. We'll need affidavits from your doctor and people who interact with you regularly." She didn't say, "You'll win." She couldn't. That would have been both dishonest and irresponsible. But she did say, "We will make them earn every inch of this." So I began to do the thing I had avoided. The ledger became gospel. I filled a 3-inch binder with tabbed sections. One section held bank statements showing 24 mortgage transfers labeled house payment, signed checks for repairs and appliances, a canceled check for a furnace repair in January that more than once had pulled a family out of winter. Another section had emails and texts, David's message strings where he had asked for help and then followed up with statements like, "We're getting back on our feet." Another contained letters from neighbors attesting that they'd seen me taking my own thrift store groceries to the house on a weekly basis, not the picture of someone financially managed by others. I asked my doctor for a letter confirming cognitive competency. He wrote one that was straightforward: regular checkups, normal cognitive screenings, and a note that I had long managed my own affairs. With Sarah's guidance, I began to prepare for the possibility of court. She suggested, carefully, that I record certain conversations if they were coercive or threatening. I remember the hesitation. Recording people is a strange thing to consider. It's intimate in a way, to capture someone's voice without their knowledge. But she said there are jurisdictions where one-party consent is permitted. This is about protection, Maggie, not about tricking your family. I am not going to tell anyone what to do. This is my story of the choices I made, not a how-to. What I can tell you is that I followed counsel's advice. I recorded a few conversations in which demands were made directly. Voices saying, "You know what to do. Don't make this harder than it has to be." And a repeated, sickening phrase, "It's just money." When you have a recording, you can listen back and hear your own voice steadying, hear the other person's impatience thin to a thread. Those recordings would later be crucial to show motive and pattern, but at the time, they felt like a safeguard. Word traveled. I received a call from Martha, the financial advisor who had handled some of my accounts when Frank was alive. Martha had always spoken in an even, practical cadence. "I'll pull everything I can," she said. "Statements, transfers, direct debit authorizations. If there are any odd transfers or wires, we'll find them." Find them she did. In the file Martha produced, there were patterns that made my skin prickle. Repeated cash withdrawals after a transfer came into a joint account, transfers to accounts with unfamiliar names, a series of charges at obscure companies that didn't match anything a family should reasonably need. I don't want to be flippant. People do business in all kinds of ways, but these transfers didn't look like groceries or school fees. They looked like money on the move. As we prepared, the pressure in my life shifted from emotional to legal. At parties where I'd once been the one to bring the lemon cake, I found people polite and guarded, as if everyone were trying not to be on either side of a disaster. I called the grandkids occasionally, and their voices were muffled with a child's habitual cheerfulness. But if I listened closely, I could hear the strain. The children never knew the full weight of the choices adults crammed around them. They knew only that a routine had been broken. Then came Jessica's message that set my teeth. "If you push this, you'll lose them." There it was, the emotional escalation I had been bracing for. Threats dressed as maternal concern, the implication that refusing to pay meant I had turned my grandchildren into victims. It was cruel because it attempted to weaponize my love for them. I sat with that sentence for a long while. Protecting the children, my grandchildren, became its own motive for refusing to let the pattern continue. If the money I'd supplied was enabling a deeper problem, if it was subsidizing a lifestyle that would eventually break them apart or put them in danger, then my refusal was, paradoxically, an act of care. It's odd how moral math can flip like that. Withholding money, which looks mean on the face of it, can sometimes be the only thing that stops harm from enlarging. The legal window that conservatorship opened was alarming because it threatened more than my bank account. It threatened my autonomy. Someone else stepping in to manage my finances would mean my days and my choices could be subject to court orders. The idea of being declared unable to manage my affairs, of having a stranger approve or deny travel or check writing, was an indignity that cut deeper than the money. It wasn't merely about paper, it was about agency. So the defense we prepared wasn't only about disproving the allegations of incapacity. It was about asserting that I had the right to choose the shape of my life. I had the right to say no to being everyone's safety net. That assertion feels easier when you are 50. When you are 67, with the roses in your yard and the echo of a husband's laugh in your head, it is an act that requires a very particular courage. There were small victories along the way. Sarah secured a continuance to give us time to gather affidavits. My doctor was prompt. Martha sent a spreadsheet that showed every transfer I'd made to David's account, label and date, and, chillingly, additional transfers out of that account that went elsewhere. Numbers, when lined up, begin to speak a truth in a way that storytelling cannot. 24 mortgage payments, 10 large withdrawals in the months after a transfer, 3 transfers to an account in Nevada with a name I had never before heard. I should have noticed sooner, I told Sarah once, sitting in her office as if I were back in her classroom explaining why I'd missed an assignment. She smiled with the patience of someone who sat with clients who say the same thing on repeat. You noticed now, she said, and you're acting. That's what matters. She cautioned me repeatedly to avoid public confrontations and to let the legal process do its work. It felt like a small mercy to have parameters, some guidance in a situation that otherwise made your mind spin with every possible betrayal. We practiced. I rehearsed answers to the likely questions. I prepared to show the judge the bank statements, the cancellation of the auto pay, the doctor's note, Sarah's letters, and the recordings. I made an index for my binder because there's nothing a retired teacher likes more than to be organized. The binder was heavy when I closed it, not from weight, but from implication. This was evidence of a life quietly siphoned, a ledger of favors that had turned into dependency or worse. But even while we gathered evidence, life kept moving. The grandchildren's school had a play, and I watched from a folding chair and clapped and smiled because that's what grandmothers do. At night, I'd set the binder on the desk and pour myself a small cup of Sumatran coffee and thumb through the pages until I could almost forget why I had to be so careful. The roses were already a little ragged from a season of weather. Tending them remained a refuge. One evening, about 2 weeks before the court date, I received a call from my neighbor Marcus, no relation to the restitution attorney Marcus Webb who would later appear in a different scene of this story, an elderly man who kept his lawn immaculate and had a way of delivering gossip with the precision of a watchmaker. They were at the house today, he said. Your son and his wife, they loaded a U-Haul. I felt the floor beneath my certainty shudder. Later, I learned that the U-Haul was for safety, Jessica told me at first, but then the explanation faltered. People moving boxes becomes part of the pattern, sudden, hurried packing that doesn't match the narrative you're being given. David's temper sharpened into something I recognized in my childhood, a kind of panic that looked like anger because it was easier to be furious than to admit you're lost. When they began to say they would leave town if things continued, my stomach did that tight, fluttering thing it does before a test. I had to be practical. That was my training, my nature. If they left, who would care for the children? If they left and the court stepped in, what would that mean? I was loath to imagine the grandchildren as pawns in a family dispute. The idea of them uprooted and tossed into an uncertain system made me ache. By the time the conservatorship petition was filed, the House seemed to pivot around that paper as if it were the sun. People took sides. Calls came from relatives who had previously been silent. The family group chat became a battlefield. I tried to keep my distance. The thing I had learned over a life of teaching teenagers was that the less you feed the dramatic beast, the less it grows. But even a stoic strategy couldn't stop a feeling of betrayal that had the sharpness of a fresh cut. The week before the hearing, Sarah and I met at my kitchen table, the binder between us like a modest war plan. She laid out what we could expect. Witnesses David might call, the kind of testimony likely to be presented, the standard of proof the judge would require. I need to be frank. Law is not drama as the movies depict it. It is process and paperwork and sometimes slow, grinding, and mundane. But it is also where reputations and rights get affirmed or upended. Sarah reminded me constantly that conservatorship hearings were serious and the judge would be careful. That reassured me and stilled some of the more fanciful anxieties. What if they try to get an emergency order, I asked, because adults think in terms of worst-case scenarios. What if they tell the judge I'm a danger to myself or that I can't pay bills? Sarah set down her pen. "We have your documents," she said. "We have your doctor's note and the ledger. Emergency orders are for immediate, clear danger. You haven't shown any signs of that. We'll cuff their efforts with proof." I appreciated her bluntness. It grounded me. Even so, the convergence of family fury and legal machinery made the world feel small and pressured. I was aware of how petty it could sound. Old woman refuses to bankroll adult children, but I knew the kernel of truth that made the stakes real. The same money that had kept the lights on had been, in some ways, erasing lines between me and my family. Drawing them back felt selfish to some, necessary to me. The question of necessity is not something that sits comfortably in a court document, but in my bones, I believed that setting a boundary could protect the children in ways that more money never would. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in the navy dress again. I put my pearls on because some remnants of ritual soothe me. I packed the binder into a black tote and walked to the courthouse feeling as if I were going into a classroom to administer the hardest exam of my life. Outside, a pigeon strutted on the courthouse steps, indifferent to human drama. I smiled at it. Small comforts anchor you. We waited in a room with wooden benches that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Other people came and went. Couples, an elderly man with a cane, a woman clutching a folder like a talisman. When the bailiff called, "All rise," it felt like the auditorium hushed before a performance. My palms were cool despite the heat rising at the base of my throat. I placed my hand on the binder one more time, feeling the tabs and the weight, and realized how strange it was that a lifetime of small kindnesses had led me to this moment of proof. This was the hinge where private family life bumped up against public adjudication, where a child's offhand insult at a birthday could grow into a legal fight over autonomy. The doors opened and we walked in. The doors opened and we walked in. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old paper. I sat with my binder on my lap like a talisman, fingers tracing the tabs until they blurred. Sarah squeezed my hand once, brief, practical reassurance, and then she settled into the chair that felt appointed for serious people. Judge Patricia Wells carried herself with the patience of someone who'd read 1,000 human dramas and kept the punctuation neutral. She asked us to state our names, and when she spoke, her tone made me think of a teacher who will not be rushed by melodrama. David's lawyer made the first move. He described a narrative that had been rehearsed in comfort. Age-related lapses, confusion at times, a supposed inability to manage finances. There were phrases that sounded designed to create a picture, not of malintent, but of helplessness. Someone used the word vulnerable in a way that wanted pity. That is the bleak power of language. You can paint someone small with a soft brush and convince a judge it is palette, not portrait. I remembered my high school classroom and how a bad comma could change a sentence. I thought now of how the omission of a fact could change a life. Sarah called witnesses. First, my doctor, who explained, calmly, clinically, that I had regular cognitive screenings, that I attended to my appointments, that there was no evidence I needed court supervision. Then Martha, who laid out, with an accountant's crispness, the chain of transfers, dates, amounts, the recurring pattern of $2,000 monthly withdrawals sent from my account to David's mortgage account, and then dispersals that didn't fit ordinary household expenses. She pointed to lines on a spreadsheet and said simply, "These are transfers in, and these are large withdrawals shortly thereafter." Numbers do a quiet thing in court. They don't rant, they reveal. Sarah played the recordings I had made. My voice, calm at the moment, sounded steadier to my own ears than I remembered feeling. David's voice, the recorded one, had an edge, exasperation wrapped thinly in plausibility. He said, "You know what to do," in one clip. In another, he tried the charm approach. "Mom, we're just fine. You'd ruin us if you stopped." The sound of his words in that room, stripped of the kitchen clatter and the lunchtime din, sounded different. You could hear motive in the pauses. When the judge listened, she did not flinch at the idea of family friction. She did not romanticize fear or reduce evidence to spectacle. She asked practical questions about the level of proof required for conservatorship. Was there immediate danger? Were bills left unpaid? Had there been lapses with medication? We had documentation. We had doctor's notes. We had bank statements showing that the bills were being paid precisely and consistently, often by me. At one point, the judge looked directly at David and said, "The law is reluctant to remove an adult's autonomy without clear, convincing evidence. It also does not exist to serve as a financial remedy for family disputes." The words landed like a gavel strike without gavel. I didn't revel. I felt relief so unadorned it was almost quiet. Judge Wells denied the petition. She noted the concerns in the petition, but concluded there was insufficient evidence that I lacked the capacity to manage my affairs. More than that, she found the pattern suggested questions of motive that ought to be investigated. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential financial elder abuse. That last line felt like light sluicing through closed blinds, an opening for accountability beyond our family drama. Outside the courtroom, people moved with ordinary purpose. A man in a suit checked his watch. A grandmother adjusted a cardigan. But inside my head, there was the clang of an unseen bell. Our first battle had been won, not because justice had arrived fully formed, but because the attempt to strip me of my agency had failed. What followed, however, was not a quiet retreat. It became clear within days that losing in court had not softened David or Jessica. If anything, it made them unpredictable. The morning after the hearing, a neighbor called to say a U-Haul had appeared again at their address. Boxes were moving. Someone had the audacity to pack as if the rules of situations apply only to other people. I remember the precise way the air felt the day I learned they'd left. It was late August. The roses were shading their heads against heat. My phone rang. The voice on the other end was breathless and young. Chloe, my granddaughter, who was 8, but in that moment made to shoulder words she should not have to carry. "Grandma," she said, "they left us." There was silence on my end, a kind of held breath. "Left you where?" I asked, keeping my voice steady because a child's heartbeat on the line makes you adult in an instant. "At the house. They said they'd be back. They won't answer their phones." My hands moved before I had a plan. I called Sarah to tell her what I knew. She urged calm and action. I called my neighbor Marcus. He agreed to go by and check the house until I could arrive. Then I called Child Protective Services. It felt like a betrayal of a certain family code. Don't let outsiders into family business. But the law and a sense of duty to children outweigh codes of convenience. Maria Santos, the CPS caseworker, came promptly. She had a professional softness, but she was direct. "We have to make sure they're safe. Because you called, we will proceed with an emergency response." Her journal, compact, neat, contained checklists and options. One of those options was to place the children in emergency foster care if the parents could not be located or returned quickly. When David and Jessica were not located that evening, Chloe and Tyler were placed with a pair of foster parents, Linda and Tom Morrison, who ran a quiet household 3 towns over, and whose living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and dishwasher soap. The Morrisons opened their home without drama. They texted a photograph of Chloe curled up on their sofa with a stuffed rabbit, and Tyler sitting at their kitchen table, puzzling over a board game like any boy who wanted something steady to do. The children appeared tired but not terrified. That was the only kind of relief I could find in that early night. Watching my grandchildren carry their backpacks into somebody else's house was a kind of grief that didn't make itself conventional. I was furious, and I was breaking with a private sort of mourning I hadn't expected to feel for the life they'd known. But it was also a clarifying pain. Something about being willing to tolerate humiliation to avoid harming them had been my reasoning until the public insult at the restaurant and the pattern of chronic dependence made me see that handing over another month of payments would have been to prolong a dangerous pattern. I arranged meetings with Maria from CPS. She explained the process with a social worker's clarity. Emergency placement is temporary. Family members can petition for custody if they meet safety and stability standards. There were visits to be arranged. Parenting classes or evaluations might be required of the parents. She did not advise me. She explained the systems. She stressed the children's well-being as the primary concern. That removed some of the moral ambiguity. We were no longer arguing a family quarrel. We were securing stability for 2 children. So I did what felt both terrifying and inevitable. I filed for custody. That sentence, "I filed for custody," felt like a proclamation and a prayer at once. There is a moment when you realize that your life is not merely your own. A grandparent can be a refuge, but to become that refuge, you must be willing to step into the public machinery of courts and petitions and mediators. It is a bureaucratic sort of bravery, all forms and affidavits, a different kind of courage than locking a door in the face of a grown child's demand. Sarah guided me through the process. We compiled records of my home, photographs of the grandchildren's bedrooms at my house. I had quietly stocked a small room with a child-sized bed and crayons because I would be foolish to be unprepared. School records that showed stable attendance when the children had stayed with me, letters from teachers praising Tyler's responsibility and Chloe's bright progress. Linda and Tom wrote statements about the children's current condition, that they were eating, sleeping, attending school, and that despite their confusion, they responded to steady routines. The social worker's report, an impartial note about the conditions, about me, about the children's bonds, was thorough and, in my case, supportive. Maria had documented that the parents were transient, the house sparse in maintenance, and that the children's needs were best met by a stable caregiver willing and able to provide for them. Custody hearings are not dramatic in the movie sense. They are slow, methodical evaluations. But there were moments that felt like fulcrums, and one of those came when the foster mother, Linda, testified quietly about Chloe, saying, "Grandma keeps everything neat," and Tyler remarking that he liked to help me in the garden. Those small domestic facts, bedtime rituals, rhymed stories, the smell of coffee, carry enormous weight in a judge's mind because they are concrete evidence of attachment and stability. At the hearing, I told the court simply, I want to be their guardian because they need a steady place to grow and because I am able to provide that. I spoke about the roses in my yard because something about tending a garden is a shorthand for care. I mentioned the binder because order mattered. I did not disparage their parents. I stuck to facts. Sarah had taught me the power of measured testimony. Speak plainly, speak to what you know. Judge Wells listened again, this time in a different capacity. She asked questions that probed not motives, she was not trying to moralize, but practicalities, housing stability, income, plan for schooling, medical care. I answered, and I felt the strange sensation of adult claims becoming legally relevant. In the end, the judge granted temporary custody to me with visitation conditions set for the parents under supervision. It was not a vindictive ruling, it was a protection. I felt a strange mingling of relief and grief. I was grateful to have the children with me. I knew their loss of a home, of routine, was a wound that would close slowly. For months, we built a life again. There were scraped-knee moments and homework and dinners where the table seemed to shrink with the addition of papers and laughs. Tyler helped me plant an extra row of roses, and Chloe insisted each bloom needed a name. They needed a steady schedule: breakfast at 8, school drop-off, piano lessons, soup on rainy afternoons. The small domestic rhythms stitched a torn fabric into something wearable again. All along, law enforcement had not been idle. The district attorney's office, acting on Judge Wells's referral, assigned Detective Rodriguez and Detective Walsh to look into the financial side. Detectives are less like movie sleuths and more like patient stitchers. They take threads and pull and wait to see how the whole fabric responds. They uncovered things that I had not known. David and Jessica's names began to appear in police logs across county lines. Reports of stolen equipment, of fraudulent invoices, of construction tools sold in odd places. One afternoon, they came to my kitchen table and unfolded a set of photographs of heavy construction equipment with serial numbers scratched away and an inventory list that bore my handwriting? My handwriting? On a delivery receipt that had been photocopied and altered. My name, it turned out, had been used without my knowledge in a messy weave of racketeering tactics. There were invoices with my account listed as the payer, checks forged, and registrations under aliases. It was dizzying to see how one's financial footprint could be doctored into a map leading to places you had never intended to go. The detectives' inquiries deepened into a federal matter when it became clear the thefts crossed state lines and included identity theft elements. That is a phrase that makes people avert their gaze: identity theft. It is not only about money, it is about the theft of the fact of you. Someone can make your name sing a different tune. When the arrests finally came, they were not cinematic with handcuffs in the driveway so much as methodical. I was not there for the arrests in Las Vegas, though later I would see images of them in news clippings marked as clipped and slid under my kitchen door. Instead, I learned the details through the detectives and later, obscurely, through my morning paper. David and Jessica were taken into custody in Las Vegas on charges related to stolen construction equipment. The story widened. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions found links to a larger theft ring. It turned out these weren't isolated petty crimes. They were part of an organized method of buying and reselling stolen goods, laundering funds through shell accounts, and, most painfully for me, using stolen identities to cover trails. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, thumb on the pearl necklace out of habit, reading the preliminary indictment summary Detective Walsh slid across the table. It listed charges: conspiracy, interstate transportation of stolen property, identity theft. The language was spare, efficient, less dramatic than the hurt it described. The detective said the federal grand jury was convening and agents had a list of people they wanted to interview. My name was on that list now as a victim too, which added an odd twist to the narrative. When federal agents contacted me, they were careful, formal, and sometimes painfully kind in their explanation of procedures. A man named Agent Mark Reynolds asked me to bring all of my financial records into a small conference room downtown. He explained that the investigation could reveal hidden assets, and that if such assets were connected to criminal enterprises, federal forfeiture processes could be used to recover funds for victims. The words forfeiture and restitution had a bureaucratic weight that barely registered with me emotionally until the following months when files and binders were shipped into my hands like small legal miracles. I testified several times, first to local detectives, then to federal agents, and later at hearings. My testimony was factual, measured. I read the same lines about 24 mortgage payments and the nature of transfers. I explained how my signature had been used to authorize payments, how my account had shown withdrawals I did not recognize, and how certain invoices bore my name, though I had no recollection of those transactions. It felt strange to have my life cross-examined in this neutral way, but I kept to the ledger. The records were my armor. During the federal investigation, they uncovered a larger web than even the detectives had expected. Hidden accounts, shell corporations set up in other names, and almost $1.8 million in assets were traced to the ring's activities. I remember sitting with Marcus Webb, the attorney who later handled restitution, and hearing him say the figure in a voice that suggested both surprise and careful pragmatism. "This is more than a local hustle," he said. "It's systemic. There are vehicles, storage units, and bank accounts across states. It will take time to untangle." Time. There is that word again. The slow currency of legal process. The federal case moved through grand juries and indictments. Then the trial. I traveled that road as a witness and as a person whose name had been used against her interest. I watched as evidence that had once been mere numbers on a page was laid out in a courtroom with photographs, ledgers, surveillance footage showing trucks moving in patterns that criminal investigators could now read like sheet music. David's defense was, predictably, an attempt to deflect. He told a story in which he was a small actor caught in a larger scheme. But the forensic accountant's testimony laid out the flow of funds with a clarity that made narrative evasions hard to sustain. Witnesses from companies where stolen goods had been sold testified to transactions that now appeared suspicious. People were asked to identify handwriting on dubious receipts. I was asked to identify my own signature. Seeing your own handwriting in a fraudulent document is an odd kind of betrayal. Your letters shape mischief as if the pen had been an accomplice. The trial ran for weeks. There were long days in court and shorter nights where I would sit in my kitchen chair and watch the small roses at the window fold in on themselves. The emotional arc was not a tidy crescendo. It was a series of small confirmations, this bank transfer, that ledger entry, that accumulated like pebbles dropped one by one into a pond until the surface rippled with undeniable patterns. In the end, the jury rendered a verdict. David was convicted on multiple counts related to theft and identity fraud. Jessica faced related charges and was also convicted. I will not recite sentencing details you might imagine in a comic thriller. Sentencing is its own process, and I have no intention of speculating. What I will say is that conviction brings consequences, accountability, imprisonment, and reparative efforts through restitution processes. The restitution phase is where legal process tries to translate harm into repair. Marcus Webb, the attorney tasked with navigating forfeiture and restitution, showed me a ledger that read like a map to hidden money. It was slow work, legal teams tracing assets, arguing over what could be seized, presenting affidavits to a judge who would decide on equitable remedies. But eventually, some of the funds were secured and directed to victims. I learned then what it feels like to be recognized not only as a plaintiff in a family argument, but as a victim of identity theft. The government is not a perfect patch for wrongs. It moves in its own time and with its own limits. Yet there was, finally, concrete recompense. The restitution process resulted in a substantial recovery. Approximately $900,000 was designated to compensate victims identified in the case, including me. Those numbers were not about riches. They were about remedy, about securing tuition funds, stabilizing housing, and restoring a sense of fairness I'd not known I would want so fiercely. Receiving the restitution check was surreal. It sat in my account a few days before we moved any money. I remember looking at the figure and feeling a complicated mix: vindication, sorrow, relief, and a sense of the absurd that money could be both the instrument of harm and the instrument of repair. I paid my taxes and fees like any citizen. There were accountants and forms, and a tiny part of me that chuckled at the idea of a retired English teacher populating spreadsheets. I used a portion of the restitution to set up a trust for Chloe and Tyler's education, a small, conservatively invested fund to ensure they would not be financially hostage to their parents' poor choices. I established a college savings account for each child and put aside an emergency fund for their immediate needs. I also allocated a sum to a nonprofit that assists older adults who are victims of financial exploitation. It felt right to do more than repair my own loss. To my surprise, the idea of turning my private pain into public prevention felt like a form of justice beyond the courtroom. People have asked me whether money healed things. It did not erase the betrayal or the loneliness of those early weeks. It did not remove the sting of a granddaughter's "you're nobody" or the years of feeling used, but it afforded practical security and the ability to make choices for the children that did not include their parents' demands as a condition. Through the trial and its aftermath, I found I had changed in ways I had not expected. The woman who once smoothed a child's shirt and wrote checks quietly had become a protector with lines drawn and a binder in the kitchen, someone who would call a lawyer before a bailout, someone who would place the children's welfare above family optics. My teaching instincts, clarify, document, correct, served me well. I taught other small lessons too: how to spot a recurring pattern, how to ask for documentation, how to put your signature guardrails on where necessary. I became active in a small circle of older adults who were learning to set boundaries. We met monthly at the library, tea, short talks, and the gentle exchange of stories. I spoke about the ledger and the pearls and how rosy the garden could look while something gnawed in the soil. I told them, plainly, that calling a lawyer is not an act of disloyalty. It is an act of stewardship over the life you still have and over those you might protect. When people ask me now whether I regret the decision to stop paying the mortgage, I have a careful answer. Regret implies wishing for a different outcome. I do not wish I had continued to give in the same way. I do grieve the fracture that occurred, but trauma does not always yield to simple causality. My refusal did not create the theft ring. It exposed a problem that had already existed. Sometimes saying no is what brings rot to light before it can spread. That is a hard message to live with when children are involved, but it is the lesson that crystallized for me. There were softer moments too, small domestic rewards that balanced the heaviness. One spring evening, after Tyler had finished an algebra homework problem and Chloe had traced her name in a loop of pink crayon, they both came to the kitchen with cookies they'd made for me. They were messy with sprinkles and sugar. Chloe put her sticky hands on my cheek and said, "Grandma, we're staying here, right?" I felt the question as a plea and as a test. "Yes," I said, "we're staying here together." The feeling that followed was not triumph so much as a quiet settling. It is remarkable what ordinary warmth does after months of papers and depositions. I maintained a certain measured distance from the urge to gloat. People sometimes asked whether I felt vindictive at David or Jessica. I felt steadier than that. What I felt most was the relief of being taken seriously, the satisfaction of setting a boundary that protected not only my finances, but my grandchildren. There was a moral clarity that came with preserving their childhood over the illusion of family polish. I also learned to laugh in strange places. A neighbor once teased me about the sensible sneakers I began to wear to court and meetings. "Your pearls and sneakers are your uniform now," she said. I laughed back. There's a kind of dark humor that sustains you through protracted processes. It is not mockery so much as the ability to keep a human shape in the face of absurdity. Today, the roses bloom again in a new arrangement. We planted an extra row for Tyler to tend, and Chloe named the brightest bloom Hope, because she had decided roses deserved a proper name. The house is filled with sounds: a violin practice on Tuesday evenings, the rustle of library books on Sunday morning, the clink of a spoon against a mug on chilly afternoons. There is still a scar where the family quarrel nicked me, but the children are growing into secure rhythms. They have counselors who help when memories darken their days, and they have a structure that is designed to hold them. Sometimes people frame stories like mine as heroic arcs where the elder rises up and slays dragons. I prefer to paint it in less cinematic colors. It was a slow remaking. An older woman who kept records, asked questions, refused to enable, and worked with legal professionals when necessary. It was a community of professionals who did the patient, bureaucratic work of jurisprudence and social care. It was a marriage of small acts, documenting, recording, insisting on facts that piled up until they could no longer be ignored. If there is a lesson I want people to take away, it is threefold. First, boundaries are acts of love, sometimes disguised as harshness. They can protect those who matter most. Second, documentation matters. Keep notes, keep receipts, know your accounts. In a world where your name can be misused, record-keeping is dignity. Third, there is no shame in asking for help: legal help, financial advice, community supports. We are, at our best, mutual. I do not close the chapter on family lightly. There are letters I did not write, apologies I did not receive, and a complicated tenderness for any parent who falters. But I also hold a fierce gratitude for the people who stood with me. Sarah, whose steady counsel felt like a lantern. Martha, who unearthed numbers buried in noise. Maria, the CPS caseworker, who reminded me this was about children's well-being. Detectives Rodriguez and Walsh, who stitched threads into a case that helped others. Marcus Webb, who turned forensic accounting into relief. And those quiet neighbors who watched over my roses. As for the title that many of you might have come for, the one that began with ridicule and ends with revelation, yes, they laughed. My granddaughter called me nobody with an 8-year-old's blunt certainty. It cut and it hardened me into action. The shocking turn was not a single cinematic reveal so much as the slow unthreading of a pattern, a family that had learned to lean on me until the leaning became taking, and beneath that, a criminal enterprise that used names and livelihoods as camouflage. The turn that shocked me was that my own routine generosity had been rerouted into something I never intended to fund. The turn that satisfied me was watching a system, local detectives, federal agents, judges, work to restore some justice. So, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe if this story resonates with you. Share if you know someone who needs to hear a word about boundaries or about the quiet power of saying no. I close with a small teacherly aphorism that steadied me through everything. Being kind does not require you to be a wallet. You can love fiercely and still set limits. You can be generous and still be wise. If you have set a boundary with family, if you've had to choose protection over appeasement, or if you have a story of standing quietly and letting the law and truth do their work, share it in the comments. We can learn from each other. You are not alone.